name's Bradley Thomas. I'm lucky enough to be the president of FinPro and Chief Executive Officer at Hepburn Shire Council, and will be your chairperson for today. Can I first pay my respects to our traditional owners of lands, and we're very much meeting on different lands today. I'm on the Judge Own lands, but I'm sure many of you are on various lands across our great state and maybe even outside Victoria. So I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Unfortunately, bloody COVID's got us again, and we're having to do this in a virtual environment, which we're probably getting a little bit too used to at the moment. We had really hoped to have been in person back down to Melbourne, but obviously this latest lockdown has meant that we'll be in the virtual elements today. But hopefully, with the cases reducing and a little bit of luck and everyone doing the right thing and going out and getting their jab, hopefully we've got better times ahead of us at the moment, and really we're forward planning for our October PD conference to be bigger and better and back in person as well, so looking forward to that. Obviously, can I a big shout out also to those councils that have been impacted by the storm events of the last week. One disaster or emergency in terms of a pandemic is probably enough, let alone throw in another one as well. So I know for those particularly areas that have been hard hit by flooding and storms events, it's probably been one hell of a week. Yeah, hopefully you do get some rest over the weekend as well. Because it's sort of budget adoption season, end of year financial year planning, and their local government is getting busier and busier, and finance is getting busier and busier. So make sure you continue to look after yourselves and take those breaks and do what sort of suits you to relax, whether it's reading a book, getting out and seeing your family or friends, or maybe when we're allowed to get back to the footy. So make sure you look after yourselves. Today we've sort of split today into two parts. We've got the Victorian Ombudsman and the ESC to present. We'll take a short break, let you go and stretch those legs, walk down to your kitchen and make a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and look at sort of the long-term financial plan and hear from three staff members that are sort of in the progress of putting that together. So without further ado, we'll go to our first speaker. I'm very lucky that we've been able to secure Deborah Glass, who's the Victorian Ombudsman, to come and speak to us today. I've just met her before, and so I said you've got to have a room full of accountants, and almost I think all 79 councils are being represented today. Deborah Glass is the Victorian Ombudsman, appointed in 2014. She has a fantastic and decorated career that we've agreed we won't go through in all the detail, but it's fair to say if you look up her accomplishments, we're very lucky to have her in the role here in Victoria, and she'll be here to sort of speak through the recent report that's been tabled, and also give us a little bit of oversight of what the Victorian Ombudsman does. So welcome, Deborah. Thank you very much for coming along to FinPro, and very much looking forward to hearing from you. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Brad, and good morning all. I'm going to rely on my trusty assistant, Jason, to share his screen and take us through what will be a relatively brief presentation, because I am keen to hear from you and to take your questions. But let me first greet you from beautiful Boomerang country, where I join you today, and acknowledge that wherever we are on traditional lands of the First Peoples, that land has never been ceded. It always was, and it always will be Aboriginal land. What I want to do today is talk to you a bit about what the Ombudsman does. I would normally at this point say how nice it was to see you all, but actually I can't see any of you. And for all I know, and I suspect you are, you're sitting there in your tracky bottoms and your Ugg boots because it's cold and wet, and with a nice cup of steaming tea or coffee in your hands. So I have to imagine that I can see you and that we can have this engagement. But I'm really over the whole Zoom business. I don't know whether you are, but I'm going to at least try to pretend that there is a room full of people in front of me and that we can communicate with each other more easily than through a a laptop. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what an ombudsman does. I'm going to give you a little bit of background generally and in the context of local government, and then I will talk mostly about my latest report on financial hardship. What I want to start today, though, is with a very, very brief history lesson. And this is a quote from the Attorney General of New Zealand at the time, back in the 1960s. Because the point I want to make here, and the reason I put this up, is that the concept of the ombudsman actually goes back centuries. I mean, arguably back to the tribunes of ancient Rome or beyond. But the modern incarnation of the ombudsman was in New Zealand. And New Zealand actually had the first ombudsman in the sort of common law world. And this quote for me epitomizes why the ombudsman exists. And it's fundamentally about the imbalance of power between the individual and the state. And if you can think back, to the growth in bureaucratic decision-making that very much expanded in the second half of the 20th century. So the ombudsman exists because of that concentration of power in the state, in the bureaucracy, as it were, which is represented by all of you this morning, and how that impacts on the lives of the average person. So Victoria's had an ombudsman since 1973. We were a little bit behind New Zealand, but we were still one of the earlier ones in Australia. So the office has been around for nearly 50 years. I'm a constitutionally independent officer of the Victorian Parliament, and I have the powers of a Royal Commission. That surprises a number of people, but I think it is important background to what I want to talk about today. So I was appointed to my role in 2014. I have a 10-year non-renewable term, and as I like to remind members of Parliament when I talk to them, that's 2.5 times a term of government, so you better get used to it. So that's a very, very short history lesson. Now, what I want to briefly talk about now is so what do I do? Well, I have, as it happens, I have 4 main functions. The first and obvious one is investigating complaints. That's something that you will, I hope, all be aware of. Lots of people actually aren't aware of that, interestingly. They see the ombudsman only for the big set pieces, the usually involved politicians, rather than an entity that people can go to if they have what might be regarded as a minor problem. So that's one key function. The second is investigating public interest disclosures. So these are the ones that tend to attract a certain amount of headlines. You might have seen my report last week into the IT contractor at Melton City Council. That's an example of a public interest complaint that is referred by IBAC. The third area is around systemic issues. So that might be whether from a large number of complaints or simply something that comes to my attention through intelligence gathering or other means. And I have a very limited capacity to investigate systemic issues, but I do them. And the examples here, as you can see, might have been around parking fines, or indeed, if you saw last year, the work that I've done in relation to workers' compensation and WorkSafe, a couple of major systemic investigations. And finally, I investigate, and this is a very small part of my work, but quite headline grabbing, referrals from Parliament. There aren't very many of them, but when I get them, they usually are significant. So that's very broad overview, and I'm skating through here of the work of the office. And you may be asking, well, where do councils fit in with all of that? So let me turn to specifically the role of the Ombudsman when it comes to local government. You can, I hope, see from that chart, and it might be a little bit small on your screens, local councils are the second largest area of complaint to my office. That's been true, I would say, for the entire time I've been in my role. And I think it's been true for many years before that. I have a very broad jurisdiction. I look at over 1,000 public bodies, and local councils have almost invariably amounted to about a quarter of the number of in-jurisdiction complaints I get every year. It's about 3,500 a year. It's the second highest after prisons. And if anybody's wondering why I get so many about prisons, it's because there is a free call line to the Ombudsman's office in every Victorian prison. Now, I would venture to suggest that if there was a free call line to the Ombudsman in every Victorian home, we might get a lot more complaints about local councils. Now, I don't say that in a negative sense. The reality is that every Victorian has a relationship with their local council. It is not surprising, and I don't see it as a negative that we get so many complaints about councils. But that's so inevitably it's a theme that I am looking at. So let me turn now specifically to the latest investigation, and what I would like to do is to play you a short video to set the scene. This is an example of Sod's Law. The video always works beautifully until we're about to begin.
And basically I just got a blanket, we don't waive rates, we only, it's going to affect other ratepayers, it's unfair on them. I was quite shocked because, we're a community that's meant to help each other and the council's there for the people. And there was numerous back and forth emails, I just couldn't accept it. It was just like I was on death's door, and to think that the people that are meant to sorry.
Hundreds of thousands of people across Victoria have to pay rates. This could be a problem for some, perhaps more so since the pandemic. I wanted to examine how struggling homeowners would be treated if they fell into debt, and whether council practices were fair and reasonable. I found wide inconsistency across Victoria's 79 councils. While some had good, easy-to-find policies, others were inaccessible and in some cases unfair and wrong. Almost all councils had a hardship policy, but they varied widely. Good policies included easier ways to pay rates and engaging with local financial counsellors. Some councils were too quick to sue, including litigation against victims of family violence and people with mental health issues. And some councils had an over-reliance on debt collectors. Too many people were told their only option was a payment plan, when the legal framework includes deferrals and waivers, which some councils had a blanket policy of refusing.
Some people may not know that they're in hardship. They may not acknowledge that they're actually in hardship themselves, financial difficulty. I can get out of this. I can work my way through it. I'm too proud to admit that there's an issue here, or there are obstacles in their way, or stressors like family violence or financial abuse that are in their way to being able to deal with hardship in relation to any kind of debt that's owing.
And so basically I do have an underlying illness of Crohn's, and I couldn't look after myself, couldn't pay myself, couldn't afford my medication. I basically couldn't pay rates. They have delayed my rates till March this year, and I recently sent an email saying I'm still in dire financial situation. I'm surviving on disability benefits because my Crohn's has just got out of control, and I promised the council that I would pay my future rates in instalments and with help from my family, the disability benefits, and the little work I did have, I have kept those up. But if I have to go back and pay those ones that I requested to be waived, I'll never recover from it.
I mean, we've seen this problem in other industry sectors. If you don't say the magic word hardship, then no one ever even tells you what assistance they can provide. But at its worst, and look, there's a lot of variations in council practices, and the Ombudsman quite rightly points to a number of councils that were doing really good things, and our members absolutely love those councils where they work there, to see in those local government areas, to see that those councils supporting people, members of their community, really well. But at the other end of the spectrum, you've had councils that had really, really poor practices, where they really almost took it. They assumed that anyone that was in hardship was trying to, do the council over, and that it was legitimate for them to attack them and go after them in various ways. And this was very, very destructive in a number of circumstances. People in hardship, they're going to have trouble with a lot of their bills. And in our sector, we deal a lot with banks, with utilities, where there's a lot of debt and there's a lot of pressure on families. People are cutting back on their food just to pay power bills. One of the concerns always is that people might appear to be keeping up with the rates, but you can't even see how much they're going through to do that, and how much that's putting costs and risks onto them in terms of health and well-being in other ways. So hardship is quite a significant problem in our communities, and it's very easy for its impacts to be kind of ignored or minimised when people owe a debt to an organisation like a council. If anything short of a very strong supportive response that really appreciates those sorts of circumstances can be really, really damaging.
The public sector is expected to act in the public interest more than the private sector. Local councils lag behind these, including banks. My key recommendations include greater protection for ratepayers in hardship and more consistency across councils. Nobody wins from heavy-handed approaches, least of all the public interest. But the good practice we have seen both in councils and elsewhere shows it is possible to do it better. When it comes to hardship, too often we're on our own.
I hope that video set the scene for you, and I hope it was mostly audible for you. The version I was listening to had a bit of a lag on it, so apologies for that. The original version, which we'll supply you with, is actually very clear. But what it does is highlight a key finding that I'm sure will not surprise anybody in this virtual room, that councils do it very differently. And some of that is inevitable. I acknowledge that you're going to have different practices in large metropolitan councils and small rural ones. But some of the inconsistency really isn't justifiable by size. And what we do point out in the report is good examples and bad examples right across metropolitan Melbourne and regional Victoria, good and bad in both. And when we engage with people like the financial counsellors, we had some councils described as exemplary and others as paternalistic and punitive. So what I'd like to do now is highlight some of the good and the bad that we can talk about, and I hope you can take away and think about in the context of your own practices. So let's look a bit about what good looks like. First of all, having a policy. Not every council has a hardship policy. We couldn't find them all. We actually had did some research into every policy to see whether we could find them. So looking at this from the perspective of somebody in hardship looking to see what to do, how easy was it to find out? Well, in some cases it was very obvious, very accessible, and in others much less so. So good practice, offering easier ways to pay rates, making information available in community languages, good use of discretion. We put up an example in the report of a really good response to family violence. And what was gratifying about this, because we're engaging with the financial counsellor community, and we had somebody contact us to say, I want to give you a good example, an example of what a council did really well. So it's nice to see, and that of course is in the report. And of course, engaging with local financial counsellors to understand hardship. And it's not surprising that the don'ts will be pretty much the opposite of that. You know, not having a policy, or a policy that is really hard to find, really inaccessible. Not having exercising discretion. People, as you heard in the video, who are being told their only option is a payment plan, when the legal framework actually allows for waivers and deferrals. Now, you wouldn't expect waivers and deferrals to be utilised often. You know, it would be something that would be, I would imagine, restricted to, you know, to the most extreme cases. But to have a blanket policy of refusing them actually is, in my view, wrong. We also saw, and this is on the Red Cross side of the equation, far too often councils taking vulnerable people to court, and I'm talking about victims of family violence, people with mental health issues. The too quick to sue was what many people were saying to us. So overall, we found a number of common practices that we simply thought were wrong, and you know, let me turn to a few of those that I touched on in the video, but are you know, tend to be prevalent. One is penalty interest, driving, you know, legal costs that drive people further into hardship. Over-reliance on debt collectors, which obviously causes further stress to people already in vulnerable situations. So, you know, for example, just to illustrate that, very few councils engage with a ratepayer after the debt collector has been engaged. Debt collectors, there are no specific rules on debt collectors in local councils. You know, there are standards of behaviour, but they're not specific to local government. So, for example, they're not obliged to tell people their options, and that means that and people are frightened. You know, that it will drive that sense of shame even further, and make it even less likely that people are going to be able to ultimately pay their debts. So, but I think the most disturbing finding for me was that councils overall lagged behind banks and utility companies in their approach to hardship. Now, that isn't to say that, you know, they all did it badly, and one of the examples on the screen in front of you now, which is Port Phillip Council, shows something very similar to utility companies. You know, here on your rates bill is a very prominent, have you got a question, are you having difficulty paying your rates? You know, that's you know, putting it out there that there is a recognition that this might be a problem for people. But too many councils don't recognise or acknowledge that people don't always admit to being in hardship. And as you heard Sandy Ross from the Financial Counsellors say in the video, if you don't actually use the magic word hardship, many people are simply too embarrassed or too frightened to ask for help. And we've seen countless examples of people who just pile up their notices, who pile up their bills. They don't want to open them. They're afraid, and they don't know how to apply for relief. They don't know what their options are, and the psychology of financial hardship is something that does not appear to be well understood across the sector. Again, one of the issues around mindset that we heard about, that in some councils, that if people are in hardship, it must somehow be their fault. And all of that also, of course, plays into the sense of embarrassment and shame that people feel. So in terms of the comparison, what we know is that utility companies and banks are much more proactive in identifying people in hardship. You know, they look at indicators such as patterns of late payments or non-payments, and they get in touch with people to discuss their options. They're more willing to waive debts. They offer more options. Whereas councils are more likely to, you know, to sit back, send the notice out and wait for people to ask for help. And just another observation that we make in the report, and I think it's particularly worth highlighting to this audience, is that banks and utility companies see hardship as primarily a customer service issue rather than a finance issue. So it's their customer service teams that are making the contact, not their finance people. So let me turn to what we have out there that will help you to do it better, because the purpose of this report is not to slam. In fact, on the contrary, we highlight quite a lot of good practice that is out there. It is to help you do it better and very much in the public interest. So a lot of information. There is an extensive set of guidance in the report itself that I think Jason is going to put into the chat for this session, so that you can look at that at your leisure. There is an extract from our report as to what a good approach to financial hardship looks like, which we'll also put into the chat. And there is guidance that the Ombudsman's Office has put out and continues to update, including good practice guide to dealing with complaints that we're in the process of updating, and our report on revisiting councils and complaints. So there is a lot of useful information out there if you want it, and I very much hope you do. So I'm going to just end on this with, I don't normally end on a quote from myself, but I am going to do so in this case. This comes from the report. Because what I want to acknowledge here is that I completely get council's concerns that the burden of unpaid rates falls heavily on other ratepayers, and that is potentially unfair on them, and it's potentially unfair, particularly on the smaller rural councils who depend most heavily on rates revenues. I absolutely get that, and I get that limits their ability to offer relief. But the point here, and I want to end on this point and invite your comments and questions, is around good hardship schemes getting the balance right. Because we know that it's possible. Best practice helps people to pay their rates rather than punishing them for not being able to do so. And again, the point around nobody wins from heavy-handed approaches, least of all the public interest. So if banks and utility companies can get this right, surely our good folk in local government can do so too. So let me stop at this point, and I'm very keen to take your comments and questions.
Thanks for that, Deborah. That's a great insight for us. So I appreciate that. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, if they could whack that in the chat box, we'd appreciate that, and I can ask them. As a New Zealander, Deborah, I was quite excited to see that the Ombudsman started way back in from New Zealand. Some great things have come out of there. And yeah, interesting too that we are the second most complained about sector, but right. All of our public really have a connection almost daily into local government, and I certainly won't be encouraging a free line phone put into each call centre at home. So I was just interested in terms of whether throughout the review, I know you commented on seeing sort of different practices across sort of all the 79 councils. Was there sort of any themes that came out around, I don't know, metro or regional or rural's doing it better or worse than others, or was it sort of just really a mixed box across all parts of the sector?
It's a question I was asking when we were doing our research on this, and actually the answer is no. We saw really good practice in large metropolitan councils and really bad practice in large metropolitan councils, and equally, we saw really good practice in small rural councils. So I think when people say, well, you've got to, which I get, you've got to take the differences between metropolitan, rural, or shire, and so on, and we acknowledge all of that. But there isn't a trend line that says it is obviously easier to do in one part of the sector than another. So I think the good practice that we've seen in large metropolitan councils can equally be done by any large metropolitan council.
No, good to hear. And one I suppose we've been grappling with, particularly council I work at, often it's someone that's in financial hardship. It's not one bill that will sort of tip them over the edge. So it's rates, utilities, school fees, or whatever else that it might be. Was there any sort of understanding or conversation sort of maybe with state government around a better way of being a bit more consolidated and approach to sort of financial hardship for people?
Well, one of the recommendations I've made in the report is to bring in the expertise of the Essential Services Commission, who I think I was speaking to you. They may be on the line now. I'm not sure, but they have a lot of consolidated experience in dealing with hardship because they provide guidance, of course, for the utility sector. So what we're proposing here actually is to draw on that expertise, which covers really a wide variety of areas. To say, what does good practice look like? What should councils do, drawing on lessons that have been learned elsewhere. So I don't think it's not really up to state government, I think, to try to consolidate, overall practices. But what government agencies like the ESC can do is to draw out the good practice that is relevant to different sectors and distribute that, I think, in ways that will help the public interest.
Yeah, no. The state government last year conducted a significant review of the rating system and tabled that report, I think, just before Christmas last year. Did this review sort of meet with that review team and local government Victoria and how the hardship provisions could be sort of incorporated into that rating review?
Very much so. No, we worked very closely with local government Victoria, with both government and non-government agencies in the course of doing this. And we met with them again in the context of developing recommendations. The state government review, while it was heading in the same direction as ultimately as the findings we came to, was simply not specific and targeted enough, in my view. I mean, this issue has been kicking around for a very long time. Community legal centres published a report on this back in 2012. There's been a lot of opportunity, I think, for the sector to address it, and it's not gone away. So I think that it's going to take just a bit more oomph to bring about the kind of consistency that our financial counselling community and the public rightly expect to see.
Yeah, and it's certainly challenging, and particularly for this group, I think, to manage things in a rate capped environment now as well. So that's certainly coming through. One of the questions I've had received through is sort of in terms of obviously the legislation allows for waiver and deferrals. Do you see that sort of as a need to increase that, or is it some of the other options that councils need to offer earlier and probably a bit more clear around that sort of reduction of interest charges and sort of payment plans? Is that sort of the first step, more so than jumping to that deferral and waiver component?
I think the real issue around waivers and deferrals was for those councils who simply had a blanket policy of refusing them. So, we found the number of people who said, well, the only thing I was offered was a payment plan. And some of these with penalty interest loaded. So, what they were finding with what was being offered is that it just didn't fit their circumstances. They simply couldn't afford it. They were, what was being put forward to them was going to drive them further into debt. So I'm not, I completely understand that waivers and deferrals would be only used in the most exceptional cases. But the problem we saw was they were not being used at all. And we were seeing exceptional cases. So that the need to exercise discretion is a point that I have made time and time again, not only to local councils, but I make it particularly to local councils, given the way local councils touch the lives of everybody in their communities.
Yeah. And one coming through around, I I suppose the other ombudsmen that exist, so I think you've sort of got your banking services or telecommunications ombudsmen. How do sort of, I suppose, two parts to the question, your role, chat to those ombudsmen, and how well does our sort of practices relate to sort of into those areas, the banking and telecommunications side of things?
Well, that's one of the things I point out in the report. Just to take the first part of the question, my office liaises regularly with other ombudsman officers. We network. We learn from each other. We share good practice and complaints handling regularly. But the finding, particularly around hardship, is that they are so much more advanced than we are. The telecommunications industry, the utility sector, the banking sector, all areas that have been heavily criticised in the past. And I'm sure that's why they now do it so much better, because they have been subject to a lot of flack. But there are now very, very clearly defined rules in relation to these things. That are enforceable by their ombudsman, and we simply don't have that. We have this patchwork of practices. Some really good, but some absolutely terrible. That mean that it's a lottery as to where you live, as to the kind of response you're going to get from your council.
It's certainly interesting, given they're in this sort of for-profit sector, whereas we're in the community-based sector. So interesting.
And that indeed is very much the point, And if there was one thing that really shocked me overall, it was to think that local councils are behind the banks when it comes to dealing with hardship.
Yes, it's probably not where we want to be. Just probably for our members to know, FinPro's reached out to local government Victoria to said that we'd love to work with them and partner with them in terms of some sector guidance or a model policy or something to even some training and development to help. So we're in some early discussions with local government Victoria on that, and we'll get that out to our members. It's just interesting, Deborah, in local government sectors, we're obviously used to a lot of reports from Victorian Auditor General, and what they often do is have a report, and they might come back 12, 18 months, 2 years down the track and sort of do a quick summary of how councils have improved, or maybe we haven't. Does your office do that in terms of, would we expect you to sort of come back in a period of time and do a bit of a review of what's changed in the sector?
Well, I do a number of things. One thing that I do regularly is monitor the implementation of my recommendations. So every 2 years, I table a report that looks right across, all of my investigations for the previous 2 years, what recommendations I made, and what progress we've seen in the implementation of those. So the last one I put out was in June of last year. So the next report I will be putting out, which would be obviously in next year, we'll follow up on where we have got to in this area. So that's so at a general level, that's something I always do. At a specific level around councils, because it is such a big part of my workload, such an important area for my office, and what I really want to do is for councils to do it better. I'm not in, I don't do this to get a negative headline or to do a council slam. This is, what I really want is for councils to do a better job with their public, because I would love to see, to see the day before the end of my term. I don't think it's going to happen, but it would be nice that the complaints about councils goes down because councils are doing it so well themselves. And we're beginning to see that. So we do that in a number of ways. We actually have education programs that are specifically targeted at local councils to help them deal with their complaints better. We publish good complaints handling guides. We're in the process of updating that. So in light of the latest Local Government Act, we are updating our good complaints handling guide for councils, and you will be seeing that rolling off the presses very soon. So there are specific areas that we will revisit regularly because they just come up all the time. and the way local councils deal with their complaints is a regular one. So, and the better local councils can do that job, the less work for my office. So
that's always good to hear. Interested, so a hardship policy for most of us, or I think all councils sort of will require councillor endorsement. So obviously officers will sort of put together a draft hardship policy and go through the briefing with councillors. But I was interested if there was sort of any engagement with the elected representatives through this process.
Not really. I mean, this is we engaged with the key representative groups. So, but I think they largely represent the officials rather than the elected councillors. Councillors, of course, are going to will represent their own views, and that's they could be highly individualistic, but I think that's ultimately they are how shall I put it, your problem rather than mine.
And some are more problems than others, but that's local government for you. One last question for me, and then we'll finish up. And thanks for the questions that come through. Obviously, you've had this report, which has been great for the sector to receive. You'll continue your sort of ongoing look at council's complaints. Do you see another wide-ranging report into a particular topic, maybe in the next 6 or 12 months in local government, that we should be sort of thinking about getting ourselves sorted for?
Well, I'm sure you want the answer there to that to be no.
Maybe. We might have been over-audited for a while, but yeah.
I am actually very mindful of that. And I always tread quite carefully when I'm looking at the local government sector. And some of you may or may not be aware that when I wrote to CEOs about this last year, I had quite a bit of pushback around, do you really have to do this now? We're very busy. We've got COVID. We've got elections coming up, and we really don't have time to deal with your surveys and so on. And my response to that very simply was, we will reduce the amount of information we're seeking from you so that it's practical and workable and it's not demanding on you, but actually, and we'll give you more time to respond to us. But actually, this is a really important subject now because of COVID, because of the increased risk of increased financial hardship as a result of COVID. So I'm very mindful of the burden on the sector of ombudsman reports, in addition to Auditor General and others who no doubt ask you for yet more information and carry out yet more reviews. So I don't look at the sector lightly. That doesn't mean that there won't be another topic that may crop up in the next 12 months that will be important. But I do have a very broad jurisdiction that is considerably beyond local government, and it may be that in the next 6 to 12 months we'll be engaged elsewhere. But I cannot promise you that. It's, I think one of the important points to bear in mind is that much of this is driven by what comes in the door, metaphorically speaking, at the moment. It's the kind of complaints we get will raise themes that will go into the melting pot to consider our future work. So, and this is where, unlike the Auditor General, I can't give you a sort of 3-year plan because I don't know what complaints I'm going to be receiving next year will look like. And much of my systemic work, which this is driven by what we're hearing on our complaints lines.
No, I appreciate that. I've had a couple sort of technical questions in regards to the report come through. I'll take them offline and get them through to your office and get a response to them. So appreciate those questions coming in from all our members. On behalf of FinPro and all our members, can I thank you for coming along and spending some time with us today in this virtual world. It's been fantastic to get probably a greater insight to Victorian Ombudsman that maybe for a lot of us was sort of just sitting to the side and a name that you sort of hear from time to time. But thank you for coming along to FinPro, and Hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day and weekend.
You're very welcome, and enjoy the rest of your virtual conference. And I very much hope I can address you at a real live one sometime in the not too distant future.
So do we. So do we. Appreciate that, Deborah. Enjoy. Thanks, everyone, and we'll make sure we get those slides, the video, the links, and a few questions that have been sent to me, sort of collated and put together. So appreciate that. We'll move on to our next speaker, and from the Victorian Ombudsman, we move to the Victorian Essential Services Commission. And lucky today that we've got Linda Marson from the ESC with us today. She's the Project Manager for Price Monitoring and Regulations Division at the ESC and being responsible for putting together the local government outcomes report. So we have sent out some of the information in terms of the ESC media statement and links to the report for members, but Linda's going to give us a little bit of an overview from that and show us some of the data as well that's come out of the ESC. And we also have Joel Eversham from the ESC who might jump in with some of the technical questions as we have. So thank you, Linda. 190 finance gurus in the room, all with bated breath to hear what the ESC's got for us for a local government update. So over to yourself.
Thanks for that, Bradley. I don't have any videos in my presentation, so hopefully I won't disappoint though. I'll just share my screen. How's that?
Perfect from my end.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me along to talk about the Commission's latest report on our 2021 report on the outcomes of rate capping. Before I begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on all of the lands wherever you are today. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging who may be here today. I'd like to acknowledge the connection that Indigenous Australians hold to country and culture, particularly at this time of uncertainty. For those not familiar with the Essential Services Commission, we are an independent economic regulator. We mostly deal with water and energy and the utility areas. However, we do have a role in relation to some other areas of economic regulation. And in 2015-16, when the rate capping framework was legislated, we picked up a role relating to the administration of that framework. Specifically, we have 4 roles related to the administration of rate capping, and these are to advise on the rate cap that the Minister sets each year, to assess higher cap applications from councils who may feel they need a rate rise above the cap set by the Minister, to report annually on council's compliance with either the cap set by the Minister or an approved higher cap. And our 4th role relates to monitoring of outcomes. And this is the role that I'm here to talk to you about today. So we're required every 2 years to prepare a report on the outcomes of rate capping. And this 2021 report is our 2nd of these reports, having published our first one in 2019. Both our 2019 report and our 2021 report included 2 components, basically. That there's an overall report that covers the sector as a whole, and that also looks at or provides some discussion of differences between the council groups, but it doesn't really look at the individual council level. So we've also published fact sheets, or what we call fact sheets. There's one for each council and one for each group of councils. So across both the report and the fact sheets, we look at rates, revenue, expenditure. So that's general expenditure categories as well as spending on infrastructure, asset renewal, and different service functions. And we've included information on financial indicators and council's financial position. So the aim of our outcomes monitoring role is to provide information that can inform readers how councils are operating in a rate capped environment, and also to inform whether the framework is working as intended. And also to identify early if things might be happening that may suggest a negative or adverse outcome or impact of rate capping. In terms of our sector-wide report, I'll just cover the brief findings. We found in preparing our 2021 report that annual growth in rates has slowed since the introduction of rate capping. Rate payers have paid lower rates than they would have done had historical rate rises continued. And the sector's total revenue and expenditure has grown faster after the introduction of rate capping, likely due to the stronger growth in revenue from contributions and also grants. In general, we found the financial health of the sector was strong, and the sector as a whole has a positive operating position and the ability to meet both short and long-term liabilities. However, given the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic in 2019-20, revenue did reduce in that year, and we found that if revenue doesn't bounce back from the impacts of the pandemic, particularly in relation to contributions and user fees, there are some councils that may face some difficult decisions going forward regarding their financial sustainability. In terms of our council and group fact sheets, these provide a short summary for each council. They're not intended to be performance reports. They describe what's happening in councils over the first 4 years of rate capping. Our 2019 fact sheets looked at what was happening in the 2 years before the introduction of rate capping and then the 2 years after the introduction of rate capping. But we leave it for readers to draw their own conclusions about what this data means and what their conclusions are in terms of the outcomes that councils are achieving. We publish in 2019 and again in 2021 a reader's guide to help councils, or to help readers, I should say, understand the information in the fact sheets. That includes definitions, data sources, but also some contextual information that may help readers interpret and understand the data that's presented. We've published our fact sheets in PDFs and they're available on our website, and also as an interactive dashboard. So our interactive dashboard, this is something that we've done for the first time in 2021. And this was in response to feedback we received from councils and ratepayers after our 2019 report that said interactive data would make the fact sheets a little bit more useful if they could engage with them a bit more. So because it's new, I thought I'd spend a little bit of time just going through the features. I've put the link there, and I think my colleague might put it in the chat for you if you haven't previously had a chance to look at that interactive dashboard. But that dashboard enables us to, or provides information that isn't available in the PDF fact sheets. So some of the additional features is that the dashboard enables a reader to compare a council against another council or against an average for a council group, and also to print that comparison. The interactive dashboard enables a reader to choose between nominal data or real data. And the dashboard combines data from both our 2019 fact sheets, which covered 2014, 15 and 15, 16, as well as our 2021 fact sheets. And another advantage of the interactive dashboard is that we've been able to integrate elements of the reader's guide. So instead of having to look at a separate document, you can hover or click to find relevant definitions or contextual information to help understand the data and also the data sources. And in addition to the fact sheets and the dashboard, this year we've also published an Excel workbook of all the data that's in our fact sheets, and that's available as a download on our website. As I said, we are required to do this report by the Local Government Act. But when we started undertaking and thinking about this task in 2019, we wanted to ensure that we added value, and that what we provided was a useful resource for councils, ratepayers and community members. So we did some focus groups and workshops with councils, and also we sent a survey to councils, and some of you may have responded to that survey or participated in the workshops, and I thank you if you did. It provided some really useful guidance as to what would be helpful to include in these fact sheets. So based on our engagement, we designed fact sheets that were a short summary of council's financials. Ratepayers in particular said that they were after or really interested in information summarising their council's revenue and expenditure, interested in seeing that changes over time, and also in a simplified format. So what we have tried to do is present the data as simply as possible, and also to include some descriptive text that provides some context around this data. Our fact sheets combine data from multiple sources, including the budgets, the annual reports, the local government performance reporting framework, and the Victorian Grants Commission data. Our fact sheets also include more detailed information on rates than is available in other sources. And that's the one area where we actually ask or request data from councils. And again, thank you if you're involved in providing that data to us. So that data we request from councils is about the rates or the distribution of rate increases or decreases in a council. And these fact sheets as well, coming from our focus groups with ratepayers, we've published the Reader's Guide as a separate document so that it doesn't make the fact sheets too long, but it does provide that additional information for those who are interested or need it. And following the release of our 2019 report and fact sheets, we surveyed councils again and also undertook some focus groups with ratepayers. And what we heard from councils is that they thought our fact sheets were or could be a useful resource for both councils as well as ratepayers. And we are interested to hear how councils might be using those. Some of the responses that councils provided to us suggested that they were using them to compare against other councils, obviously in the context of looking at comparisons with similar councils and understanding the differences that might still exist between those councils. But they might be using those fact sheets and the data in the fact sheets to compare outcomes for councils that they know have taken a different approach to how they've approached an issue, or they might be looking first at the data and seeing where councils are differing and then looking to find out what those differences or what might be explaining those differences. We also heard that councils may be using those fact sheets to help engage or communicate with their councillors or their ratepayers and community members, and particularly because they provide a simple summary and they're able to illustrate the connection between financial position and financial indicators and the trade-offs involved in terms of revenue and expenditure. So we welcome any feedback. We are required to report again in 2023, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do some engagement and to inform any changes that might be relevant. This isn't the forum for you to provide answers to these questions, but I've posed these because this is areas that we're interested in. If you'd like to send us an email providing any feedback you have. Is there other information you think would be useful for us to include in the fact sheets or the report? Is there information that ratepayers you think may find useful? How could we improve the presentation of the report, the fact sheets or the online dashboard? Particularly interested in that online dashboard and your experiences using it and how we might be able to improve. And the final point there is acknowledging that we have undertaken to draw on data that's publicly available that already exists, with the exception of that rates data, which does mean there are some gaps in terms of the data or potential weaknesses in terms of consistency over time or between councils. And we're interested in how much benefit you think would be obtained from greater consistency, particularly at service level data. Now, I just wanted to take this opportunity, even though this isn't what my presentation is about, just to remind you that the compliance information is due on the 30th of September this year. So that's reverting to the previous timetable. There is more information on our website, and we have introduced a new requirement this year, that better practice property and rates database checklist. So if you have any questions or issues arising, then we encourage you to contact us as soon as possible to talk about that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for that, Linda. And yeah, if you've got any questions, if you can put that in the chat box. Yeah, great to see I suppose the report being changed up, and I think the use of the interactive dashboard will be really useful. And as you say, probably for officers, a great opportunity to sort of be able to provide some of the data backed by becoming from an independent body like yourself. I was interested in one of your findings that you sort of commented around. Obviously, the rate capping came in and that sort of reduced rates going forward, which was to be expected. But council's revenue really has continued to increase because of the contributions and grants being quite significant. I wonder if the ESC made any sort of comment on that. I suppose increased reliance, particularly on grant funding, is maybe comes with some concerns as well in terms of an increased reliance on really significant body of funding coming from other places, and how councils actually plan for that, and whether that's a good, bad, or a different thing with the impact of rate capping.
I think it's we viewed our role more as presenting the information and the data. So, our findings. Obviously, that the indexation of grants leading up to or coinciding with the introduction of rate capping had some impact, and is some of the reason why we've seen an increase in grants in the last few years. There hasn't been, so far, and it's still quite early days, too much of a change in the composition of where council's revenue comes from. And then I guess now we have, I should say as well that revenue increase or stronger growth in revenue was only up until 2019-20. So taking into account COVID, it's kind of gone the other way. So we'll see in our next report how things have panned out after coronavirus, I guess. Hopefully after coronavirus.
Hopefully. And probably a good segue to the next question that's come through around, I think there was a very quiet amount of requests for a rate cap higher than requests for higher than the rate cap. Are you seeing many conversations with councils at the moment in terms of that going forward as councils respond out of COVID, or still pretty quiet in that space?
No, still pretty quiet. I guess with new councillors coming in last year, councils starting to do their their long-term plans, starting to have those conversations with their communities about different trade-offs. There were quite a few councils who froze rates or didn't increase their rates by the cap last year, or now this coming year that's just about to start. So going forward, we imagine, that those conversations are happening with the communities now in terms of what those implications are down the track, and what the communities are willing to trade off.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and thank you for coming along today and giving us a bit of insight to the report, and particularly a reminder of the great data that's available in the dashboard. So. And thanks for providing your information. And if anyone's got any questions for Linda or the local government team, please yell out. I will finish up